Good morning, everyone. On February the 26th of 1999, the skeletal remains of a small child were discovered in a wooded area in DeKalb County at the intersection of Clifton Springs and Clifton Church Road. This wooded area was next to a cemetery across the street from a church nearby that location. A gravedigger who was working that day happened to walk into that wooded area to relieve himself and came upon this discovery. He immediately notified the police department, and police responded with crime scene investigators and the medical examiner's office. The scene was secured and processed, and the remains were recovered. You'll hear that the child was lying on top of the pine straw with no apparent effort to conceal his body, but it was in a secluded area of those woods, a place that he went for a period of months without being found. You'll also hear that the child's skull had become detached from his body and was located between 6 and 7 feet away from the rest of the remains. When law enforcement came and processed the scene, they collected the body. They evaluated the earth below the body. They were able to recover some additional bones, teeth, fingers, and most of the skeleton was recovered. That skeleton was then transported to the medical examiner's office, where a death investigation occurred. You're going to hear from the medical examiner that participated and took part in that autopsy back in 1999, the day after the skeleton was recovered. You're going to hear that when they examined the child, he was clothed. He had a pullover style shirt that was plaid, kind of thermal in quality. He had a pair of red jeans and Timberland boots. After the examination, they determined, based on the size of the bones, measurements that were taken from the bones, as well as the size of the clothing and the shoes, that the remains belonged to a boy, roughly 5 to 7 years of age, and that boy had been decomposing for a period of time between 3 to 6 months. That was the estimate of the medical examiner as well as the anthropologist that did the initial investigation. Because the child was so severely decomposed, most of the types of evidence that a medical examiner would traditionally look at to help determine a cause of death was not available. There was very little skin to look for evidence of wounds or trauma. The organs weren't present to evaluate. There was no blood to test. But what was present was a child's skeleton and some tissue around the legs. The skeleton was evaluated, and the only evidence of trauma was a fracture to the right zygomatic area of the skull. That's going to be just under your eye socket. There were no other indications of trauma located on the skeleton. The professionals are going to tell you that they cannot tell you how this fracture occurred. It could be that this fracture occurred after the child's death, while the child was in the woods. It could be a result of carnivorous scavenging animals that may have disrupted the skeleton while the child was out in the woods. That is a possibility. However, you will hear that typically when you see scavenging activity, that's going to be accompanied by teeth marks, scratch marks surrounding the bone as well, and those were not present. You will also hear that this kind of fracture could occur as a result of a traumatic injury while the child was alive. Blunt force trauma. That could be from striking a child or from the child being in an injury or an accident, such as a car accident where his face was impacted. But what you'll hear is blunt force trauma in this particular area of a child's skull is not very common. And so it is typically seen in abuse cases or, again, something like a car accident. Given the advanced stage of decomposition, the medical examiner had to harvest some of that muscle tissue around the legs, that skeletal muscle, and they sent it off for toxicological examination. When you send tissue for that kind of examination, you're going to hear that what they're looking for is the presence of both illegal drugs and legal drugs. They're going to be looking for your street drugs such as cocaine, crack, marijuana, things of that nature, as well as over-the-counter and prescription medications. Anything that can help give us any indication what might have been going on with this child. And you will hear that 2 drugs and a metabolite were present in the skeletal muscle of this child's tissue: acetaminophen and diphenhydramine. And the metabolite was a diphenhydramine metabolite. Now, what the professionals are not going to be able to tell you is how much of these medicines this child had. That is not something they're able to tell you based on what was present in the muscle. However, the metabolite is instructive and can tell us that the child was administered the drugs shortly before his death. Those are the only conclusions that the medical examiner's office, in partnership with the toxicologist and the anthropologist, were able to make at the time. And so the child's death was ruled undetermined. That's how his death certificate was filled out. He was listed as a child doe because they didn't know who he was, and that was the findings of the medical examiner's report back in 1999, the day after the skeleton was found. From that point, you're going to hear about the Herculean effort by the medical examiner's office, the DeKalb County Police Department, to try to identify this child and determine why he ended up in those woods and what may have killed him. You're going to hear about how the neighborhood was scoured and canvassed for any witnesses. They spoke to members of the church. They sent bolos out to nearby area law enforcement. Are there any missing children that match this description, these clothing, this age, this gender, in any of our nearby counties? That information was sent out nationwide in databases that could be accessed by law enforcement all over the country to compare against their missing persons cases. The medical examiner's office worked with the Federal Trade Commission to track down the manufacturers of the child's shirt and pants and boots, and then worked with those manufacturers to try to determine if they could pinpoint where those clothing items were sold. They reached out to the media. There were news stories. The AJC printed articles, all soliciting information about this child who had been found in the woods, giving details about the clothing that he was wearing, anything that they knew about him, and asking the community for help. At one point, even the governor signed a proclamation and issued an order that any tips leading to the identification of this child would be rewarded with a $5,000 reward. And that was published to the community at large as well. But the case went cold. This child was not identified. There were tips, there were leads, they were all explored, and they were all excluded. From that point, the child was packaged and placed in a cabinet at the medical examiner's office, where he was known as a child doe or Clifton Doe until the point at which he could be identified. With no family to return his remains to, that little boy's skeleton sat in the medical examiner's office for over 20 years. For over 20 years. It wasn't until a very special person who happened all this time that the DeKalb County Police Department was trying to identify this child, happened to also be searching for him. And it wasn't until she came across an artistic rendering of this little boy that we were able to determine who he was. See, over the years, while William may have been placed in that cabinet at the medical examiner's office, he was not forgotten. No, stories continued to be printed. Podcasts were created. There were clay renderings made of what the child might have looked like. Artistic drawings of what the child might have looked like. These were published through both law enforcement and organizations dedicated to children, missing children, and unidentified deceased children. One of them, known as the National known as NCMEC, actually published one of these renderings that was seen by this woman who knew who the little boy was. And this woman's name is Ava McNeil. Ava McNeil looked for William all those years because she was a friend of William's mother. She met William's mother back in 1995, and they became very good friends. William was about 3 at the time, and she took a real shine to him. She's going to tell you that William was a bright, sweet child, and that she became very attached to him. She and Teresa spent a lot of time together. They were neighbors, they lived very close by, and at one point they were spending almost every day together. So William was a big part of Ava's life. But she worried about William because William didn't seem to have a very good life. William seemed to have a tough time. She's going to tell you how Teresa was not very loving towards William. She spoke roughly towards him, that William often appeared dirty and disheveled, that his clothes smelled as if he wasn't being bathed, that his hair was not routinely cut, and that the school even complained about his odor to his family. This was despite the fact that Teresa took care of herself. You'll hear that she often had her hair and makeup done, had her nails done. She had a good job. She was living with her father at the time and his girlfriend, and before that, her mother before she passed away. She had access to resources, but she didn't share them with her son. You're going to hear that Ava would ask to take William out because she felt sorry for him. He didn't seem to ever get to leave the house. He didn't seem to get to play like normal children. But Teresa wouldn't let him. Other people felt sorry for William too and would give clothing and toys to Teresa. But Teresa would just put them in a closet and never give them to William. Ava will even tell you about 2 separate incidents where she observed Teresa become physical with the child in a way that bothered her. On one occasion, the little boy complained about something he was eating, and Teresa slung him into another room and came after him, and Ava had to intervene so the child could run out of the house. In another incident, the little boy wanted to go outside and play, and Teresa wouldn't let him, and when he got upset, she punched him in the chest and called him a punk. This was the life that William Hamilton was living. Ava McNeil reported to NCMEC that this is who that little boy was, that he was the child of Teresa Bailey. And with that information, they went to North Carolina, they investigated, they were able to pull William's birth certificate, they were able to find a little boy from Charlotte, North Carolina, whose parents were Teresa Ann Bailey, now Teresa Black, and his father was William Harris Hamilton. From that point, they went to the father. Went to the father. They found him in Charlotte, North Carolina, interviewed him, and he indicated he did have a son named William, but he had lost contact with him when he was a small child, that his mother had prevented him from seeing him, and so he didn't have a relationship with him anymore. But he had no idea and was completely shocked to learn that a child that was found dead in the woods in DeKalb County could be his son, William. He gave consent to provide a sample of his DNA that was then compared to a sample from the child's remains. And you'll hear that there was evidence of a relationship or support for a relationship, a familial relationship between those remains and Mr. Hamilton, the father. With that information, the case was turned over to the DeKalb County law enforcement to follow up on additional leads. It was determined that Teresa needed to be interviewed. She was located at the time living in Arizona. At that point, law enforcement from DeKalb County arranged with the local police department to obtain a search warrant for Teresa's DNA and to try to interview Teresa out in Arizona. That is February the 15th of 2021, excuse me. When they fly out to Arizona to meet with Teresa and bring her into the interview room, she's advised of her rights. She agrees to waive her rights and speak with the officers. And they ask her about where she's lived over the years and if she has any children. Initially, Teresa says nothing about ever living in Georgia and nothing about having a son. She has a 17-year-old daughter that she talks about. They ask if there are any more children, and she says, just my daughter. At that point, the officers ask her about Georgia. And Teresa does admit that, yes, I did spend some time in Georgia. And then pretty quickly, you'll see, because you're going to hear this interview, it was videotaped, you're going to have a chance to see it as well. Pretty quickly, I did have a son. I do have a son. When she begins talking about her son, she initially says that she lost contact with him because she moved to Atlanta with her son, didn't have the means to take care of him, and left him with a friend that she met in Atlanta, and had lost touch with him by the time he was age 7 and hasn't heard from him since. Officers didn't believe that story, and they kept pressing. They challenged it. They said, so you really believe that you have a 30-year-old son alive out there living in Atlanta? She said she did. She did. They show her the artistic rendering of the little boy that was found dead in DeKalb County. They tell her that they believe that William is dead, and they believe she knows something about it. For a while, she keeps up the act. Very surprised, can't believe he's dead, very upset. But finally, Teresa admits that not only does she know that William was dead, but she was with him and he was in her care when he died. She tells officers that she moved to Atlanta looking for a fresh start with William. That initially she was staying in hotels, but her money ran out quickly. And at that point, they were having issues with housing, finding enough to eat. They were sleeping in random parks and places where they could find, and eating out of dumpsters. She said that she knew something was wrong with William, but she didn't know what. She thought maybe he wasn't getting enough to eat, so she would get him some more food, but that didn't seem to help. She said he was lethargic, that he didn't want to get up, that he didn't want to talk. The officers, knowing that this cold medicine, this diphenhydramine and acetaminophen, are what are commonly known as Tylenol, Benadryl. And you'll hear that They are found in those nighttime cold medications like Tylenol PM. Officers, knowing that those drugs had been found in William's system, asked Teresa if she ever gave him any cough medicine. She says, no, I might have given him a lozenge, but that was so he had something to eat. And she says more than once, I didn't give him any cough syrup. Teresa also indicates that at this time,
what happened here?
says we have lost the signal.
Hold on. If you don't touch the screen for a while, does it wiggle the mouse? Oh, it's showing up there. Wiggle the mouse, Ms. Jackson.
Ms. Black indicated that they were wandering around and came across these woods one night looking for a place to sleep. That she knew something was wrong with William, and she never went to a doctor. She never took him to a hospital or an urgent care center. And that they went to sleep in these woods that she came across one night, and the next morning she woke up and William was dead. She didn't know what to do, so she left him there. You're going to hear that William was withdrawn from school in Charlotte, North Carolina on December the 1st of 1998. So we can narrow the time frame. That's why you heard the date range you did in the indictment, December the 1st of 1998 until February the 26th of 1999. We know that William was taken from Charlotte, North Carolina, somewhere about December the 1st of 1998, and by February the 26th of 1999, he is found dead in those woods, severely decomposed. You'll also hear that in the course of Ms. Black's interview, she admitted that she never enrolled William in school while he was in Georgia. Given the advanced stage of decomposition, you'll hear from experts that William couldn't have been in Atlanta for very long, given the fact that they're estimating that he had been decomposing for about 3 months. So William died shortly after he got to Atlanta. In the context of the relationship that he had with his mother, the way he was being treated, the way his body was hidden in the woods, the fact that Teresa was not honest about giving him medications, this all became very concerning. You're going to hear that while these are over-the-counter substances, diphenhydramine and acetaminophen can be toxic to children. And you have to be very careful in how you administer these drugs to children. And that's why, as I'm sure you all know from your common experience, there are lots of instructions about properly medicating children with these substances. And in fact, in children under 6, it's often not even advised that you give these types of medications without the consult and advice of a doctor. Again, that is because these drugs can be specifically toxic to children if not given in the correct doses or if used for an improper purpose. You're going to hear that even if a child is given too much of these medications or the wrong amounts, that can be treated. If you go to the hospital, there are ways to treat that. But if it goes untreated, a child can die a very slow and painful death. The symptoms of this sort of toxicity in a child would be nausea, confusion, fatigue, lethargy, the very symptoms Ms. Black described William having in her interview with the police department. You're going to hear from a number of witnesses during the course of this trial who not only are going to tell you about where these remains were recovered, how they were recovered in the area, but they're also going to tell you about Ms. Black, her friends, her life, about William. You're going to hear from a number of medical experts. And I do want to do a little housekeeping. While you're listening to the evidence during the course of the trial, I just want you to be aware that not everything you see in court is going to go back in the jury room with you for your deliberations. And we like to go ahead and point this out here at the beginning just so it's not a surprise. And you can take special note of certain types of evidence while it's up if you have concerns about remembering it later. So for example, the evidence that will be back in the juror room with you for your deliberations is going to be any of the photographs that we tender, any documents or maps, and any of the physical evidence. What cannot go back with you, and this is just by law, there's nothing that we can do about it, are any of the police reports that are discussed, any lab reports or scientific reports. We're not going to have a transcript, as Judge Heydrich told you earlier on, available for you to go back and listen to or read about what witnesses testified to, or any of the audio-video recordings. You won't have them back there that you could just play over and over. But there is a little caveat with any audio or video recordings, and that's that if you need to hear something again, if you need to see something again, you can always send a note to the judge. We'll all come back into the courtroom together, and you can listen to it again. And I just like to highlight that for you at the beginning here. So again, if you feel like you need to take certain notes, you'll know what you will and will not have back in the deliberation room with you. Over the course of the trial, it's going to become clear that Teresa Black is responsible for her child's death. After you hear from the witnesses, after you hear the evidence, you'll know that Teresa Black had no connection to this wooded area where she left her son. It wasn't near the strip club where she was working at the time. It wasn't near the Decatur area where she thinks she might have been staying at one point. It wasn't near any shelters or places to seek assistance. It's just a residential neighborhood for someone who recently moved to Atlanta and didn't have a car. It was a significant distance from the area where she was actually staying. And what's going to become clear is that these woods were not some place she just happened upon. They weren't a location where she just decided to lay her head down one night. What these woods were a dump site. These woods were where she chose to dump William's body, to conceal his death, to prevent the discovery of the fact that her child had died in her care, and to prevent the authorities from being able to determine exactly how it was that he died. Over the course of the trial, it will become clear that Teresa Black is responsible. That she took this child away from his home. Ava will tell you she didn't know of anyone that Teresa had in Atlanta, any friends or any family. She questioned Teresa why she was going to Atlanta, and the best she could tell, Teresa wanted a fresh start. But she didn't have anything there. She was leaving a home where William had a place to sleep at night, where William had grandparents on both sides, both his mother's side and his father's side. You'll hear that there was a lengthy period of time where Teresa wasn't in William's life, and that her parents had actually taken care of him for her, with the help of his paternal grandparents, his aunt, and his father. That it was William's father who actually enrolled him in school and was the contact for William. She took him from all these people to go live in Atlanta, even though she had offers to help. Offers to take care of William while she stabilized herself, got a place to stay. And when William became sick because of medications that she was giving him, she didn't take him to the doctor. She didn't take him to the hospital. She didn't get him any help. And as a result, William died what was very likely a very slow and painful death, and was then left to rot in the woods until some random gravedigger happened to go relieve himself in the woods almost 3 months later. This is why Teresa Black has been charged in this indictment with 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of cruelty to children, 1 count of aggravated assault, and concealing the death of another. I expect defense counsel is going to stand up before you and say that there's no way that you can know what happened to William. There's no way that the state can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the evidence left behind of his skeleton is just not enough. But remember, during the course of this trial, that those remains are not the only evidence. You can take into consideration the circumstances of the relationship between William and his mother. You can take into consideration how she was treating William, how she was living with William. You can take into consideration the lies that she told police, the fact that she concealed that she was giving him cough medicine, the fact that she concealed his death. All of that is evidence. You don't get to benefit from the fact that you successfully hid evidence from the police. And that's exactly what the defense is going to ask you to do. Give her the benefit because she did a good job hiding what she did to her son. At the end of this trial, we're going to come back before you and we're going to ask you to render a verdict that is long overdue. Long overdue. For over 20 years, this child went unidentified. A child doe sitting in a cabinet at the medical examiner's office, waiting to be reunited with his family so that they could properly bury him. It is time to give this child justice. It is time to give his family justice. And we're going to ask you to return a verdict of guilty on each and every count. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Welty?